First thing I saw that morning was Officer Daniel Reyes stepping over my flower bed with one hand resting on his holster, while two HOA representatives stood behind him like they had just won a war. My trash bins were tipped over on the curb. My garage door was halfway open because someone had cut power to the side control panel. And standing in the center of my driveway, arms folded in a cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than my monthly electric bill, was Vanessa Cole, president of the Maple Glen Estates Homeowners Association, staring at me like she had been waiting years for this moment. "Richard Miller," she said loudly, making sure every curtain-twitching neighbor on the street could hear her. "You have ignored repeated notices, violated community codes, and refused compliance. At this point, law enforcement has been authorized to intervene." I had just stepped outside with coffee still in my hand. I was barefoot, and somehow, before I'd even taken a full breath, there were already two police cruisers parked in front of my house. One of the officers, a tall woman with sharp eyes and a notepad in hand, was speaking quietly into her shoulder radio, while another officer examined the wooden pergola frame lying neatly stacked beside my garage. That pergola frame apparently was the reason they were here. 6 cedar beams, 4 metal brackets, a half-finished backyard installation project I had legally purchased 3 days earlier. Vanessa pointed at it like she was identifying a murder weapon. "That unauthorized exterior structure violates architectural pre-approval regulations," she said. "We issued 3 warnings." "You issued 1 warning," I said. "It was taped to my mailbox yesterday." "It was mailed weeks ago." "I was out of state." "That is not the association's responsibility." Behind her stood Harold Benton, the HOA compliance officer, a narrow-faced man in rimless glasses clutching a thick folder against his chest like sacred scripture. He pulled out several papers and waved them toward Officer Reyes. "We have documentation," Harold said. "Repeated violations, non-compliance, failure to respond, illegal construction." Officer Reyes looked at me. "Sir, we need you to step away from the property while we assess the complaint." "My property?" I asked. "Yes, sir. My property that I own." Vanessa gave a thin smile. "Not entirely, Mr. Miller. Not when your ownership affects the governed standards of this community." By then, neighbors had started gathering, not close enough to interfere, just close enough to enjoy it. Mrs. Turner from across the street stood on her lawn in slippers pretending to water plants that did not need watering. Jason and Melissa Grant had paused their morning jog and were whispering at the sidewalk. Even old Mr. Leland, who rarely left his porch, was sitting upright in his rocking chair like this was the best television he'd seen in years. That was how my Thursday began. With police in my driveway, with HOA officials trying to make an example out of me, and with half the neighborhood waiting to watch me be humiliated. My name is Richard Miller. I'm 46 years old, and until 6 months ago, I was perfectly content living quietly in Maple Glen Estates, on the west side of Columbus, Ohio. I'm a structural compliance investigator for federal infrastructure contracts, which is a polished way of saying I spend most of my life examining whether people in positions of authority are following laws they think don't apply to them. I moved into Maple Glen after my divorce because I wanted peace. No downtown noise, no apartment walls vibrating from strangers' music, no politics. Just a quiet street, trimmed hedges, and a backyard where I could build things with my hands on weekends. I'm not the kind of man who starts fights, but I am the kind of man who finishes them when someone drags one onto my property. Have you ever experienced something like this? Comment below and share your story. And if you want more stories like this that might help you tackle such situations, subscribe to this channel. What Vanessa Cole did not know that morning was that this confrontation had started long before the police arrived. 3 weeks earlier, I had attended my first HOA board meeting. That was where she first decided she didn't like me. The meeting was held in the Maple Glen Clubhouse, a beige stucco building beside the tennis courts, with uncomfortable folding chairs and fluorescent lights that made everyone look vaguely guilty. I had gone because I received notice of a proposed landscape conformity adjustment fee, which sounded suspiciously like a made-up penalty for having bushes the wrong height. Turns out I was right. Vanessa stood at the podium presenting new enforcement policies with the confidence of someone who had never been challenged in public. When she announced that residents would now need written approval before making any visible exterior enhancement, I raised my hand. "What qualifies as enhancement?" I asked. "Any change affecting visual harmony," she said. "That sounds intentionally vague." "It is comprehensive. It sounds unenforceable." A few people laughed quietly. Vanessa's smile tightened. Harold Benton scribbled something in his notes. I should have let it go. Instead, I asked to see the statutory authority under the HOA charter permitting discretionary fines without appeal review. That room changed temperature. You could feel it. Vanessa answered in clipped tones that the board acted under revised covenant authority. So I asked for the revision filing date. She didn't have it. Because there wasn't one. By the end of that meeting, half the residents were murmuring and asking questions they had apparently never dared ask before. And Vanessa looked at me the way a queen might look at someone who had just laughed at her throne. 2 days later, I found my first violation notice. Improper mailbox decorative display. It referred to a small brass eagle ornament mounted beneath my mailbox flag. That eagle had been there since move-in day, no issue before. Then came another notice. Non-compliant driveway storage. That referred to 2 sealed lumber boxes in my garage driveway for less than 12 hours. Then another. Unauthorized backyard material staging. That was the pergola kit. Each notice carried escalating fines, $50, $125, $300, all signed by Harold Benton, all approved by Vanessa Cole. At first I thought it was petty retaliation, then I realized it was something more calculated. Because every notice arrived late in the evening, often after office hours, making same-day appeal impossible. Photographs attached to each complaint were taken from angles suggesting someone had been standing near my hedges. Watching. Documenting. Waiting. I installed 2 security cameras the following weekend. That turned out to be the smartest decision I made. 3 nights before the police showed up, one of those cameras captured Harold Benton entering my property at 9:17 p.m. He wore gloves. He walked along the side fence carrying a flashlight, and he photographed the pergola beams stacked beside my garage. Then he did something stranger. He opened my side gate and placed a red tag notice directly on the cedar beams. Condemned pending enforcement review. He had no legal authority to tag private property. I downloaded the footage immediately. The next morning I called the HOA office requesting explanation. Vanessa answered personally. Her voice was almost cheerful. "Mr. Miller, compliance actions are within our rights. Entering fenced property at night isn't. There is an easement clause. No easement grants trespass. You're becoming hostile." "No," I said. "I'm becoming attentive." There was silence on the line. Then she said, "If you continue obstructing enforcement, we will escalate." I remember standing in my kitchen after that call, staring at the security footage paused on Harold's face. That was the moment I understood this was no longer about a pergola. This was about power, and Vanessa Cole was used to wielding it without resistance. Back in the driveway that Thursday morning, Officer Reyes stepped closer while the female officer, whose badge read M. Henson, approached with a clipboard. "Mr. Miller," she said, "the HOA alleges refusal to comply with lawful enforcement and obstruction of authorized property seizure." I blinked. "Property seizure?" Harold opened his folder dramatically. "The pergola materials are subject to removal pending adjudication. Those materials cost $4,000. They violate code. They are unassembled lumber." Vanessa cut in. "Because you ignored repeated directives, we have contracted removal." That was when I noticed the flatbed truck parked halfway down the block. 2 contractors in reflective vests were standing beside it, waiting to haul away property they had no right to touch. I set my coffee mug down slowly on the hood of my truck. "No one is removing anything from my property." Officer Reyes shifted posture. "Sir, if you interfere with municipal officers carrying out a civil enforcement standby, you may be detained." The entire street went quiet. Even the birds seemed to stop. Mrs. Turner lowered her watering can. Jason Grant took out his phone and started recording. Vanessa crossed her arms, satisfied. This was the spectacle she wanted. Public pressure. Public embarrassment. Submission through humiliation. What she did not know was that I had already contacted someone before stepping outside. At 7:12 that morning, when I saw the first cruiser arrive through my bedroom window, I had made one phone call before putting on my shoes, and that call was the reason everything was about to change. But before that change came, Vanessa made her boldest move yet. She pointed directly at me and said, "Officer, if he refuses cooperation, arrest him." There are moments in life when time slows down enough for you to measure the weight of every face around you. Officer Reyes looked uncertain. Officer Henson looked uncomfortable. Harold Benton looked excited, and Vanessa Cole looked triumphant. Officer Reyes stepped toward me. "Sir, turn around and place your hands where I can see them." I did not move. Instead, I reached calmly into my back pocket. Officer Reyes instantly stiffened. "Slowly, sir." Vanessa actually smiled, and from 3 houses down, the black government SUV turned into my street. It rolled past the gathered neighbors without urgency, then stopped directly behind the police cruisers. Every eye on Maple Glen Drive shifted toward it. The driver stepped out first, dark suit, federal credentials clipped to belt. Then the rear passenger door opened, and the man who emerged was someone Officer Reyes recognized immediately. I saw it in his face. His posture changed before the badge was even fully visible. Vanessa's expression faltered for the first time that morning, because the person stepping onto my driveway was not here for her. He was here because of me. And the moment he spoke my name, the entire balance of power began to crack. "Mr. Miller," he called out evenly, "I believe they've misunderstood who they're dealing with." And that was when Vanessa Cole stopped smiling. Vanessa Cole's smile disappeared so completely, it was as if it had never existed. The man walking up my driveway was Special Deputy Marshal Thomas Keegan. And judging from the way Officer Reyes straightened his back, he understood immediately that this was no ordinary interruption. Keegan was in his late 50s, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, and carried himself with the kind of quiet authority that made people stop speaking before he even opened his mouth. He wore a dark navy suit with no wasted movement in his stride, and behind him came another federal officer carrying a slim black case. The murmuring among the neighbors grew louder. Mrs. Turner actually stepped off her lawn and onto the sidewalk for a better look. Vanessa recovered first, lifting her chin and stepping forward with offended authority. "I'm sorry," she said sharply. "This is an active HOA enforcement matter involving private covenant violations. Federal officers have no jurisdiction here." Keegan didn't even look at her. Instead, he stopped beside Officer Reyes and handed over identification. "Special Deputy Marshal Thomas Keegan," he said evenly. "We're here in response to a priority verification request made by Mr. Richard Miller at 0712 hours." Officer Reyes examined the credentials and handed them back almost immediately. "Yes, sir?" Vanessa's eyes darted toward me. "Verification request?" she repeated. I finally pulled my hand from my back pocket, not with sudden movement, but calmly, and removed my own identification wallet. I flipped it open toward Officer Reyes first, then toward Officer Henson, then, deliberately, toward Vanessa. The silence that followed was the kind that presses against your ears. Harold Benton leaned sideways, squinting as if the badge might somehow transform into something less inconvenient if he stared long enough. It did not. My federal credentials bore my full title, agency seal, and active enforcement classification. Richard Allen Miller, Senior Federal Infrastructure Compliance Director, National Contract Oversight Division. Vanessa blinked twice, then frowned. "What exactly is that supposed to mean?" Keegan answered for me. "It means," he said, voice level and precise, "that Mr. Miller is a federally commissioned oversight officer with authority to investigate regulatory misconduct involving abuse of procedural enforcement systems, including unlawful property seizure attempts and false claims of civil authority." The words landed like stones. Officer Henson lowered her clipboard. Harold's folder slipped slightly in his grip. And for the first time since this began, Vanessa looked uncertain. "This is absurd," she said. "This has nothing to do with federal jurisdiction." "It does," I said quietly. "When private organizations fabricate enforcement authority, trespass onto private property, and initiate unlawful detention attempts under false pretenses." Jason Grant's phone was still recording from the sidewalk. Now several other neighbors had theirs out too. Vanessa glanced around and seemed to realize, perhaps too late, that the audience she had gathered for my humiliation was no longer on her side. Officer Reyes turned toward Harold. "Sir, Did you enter this property without owner consent? Harold hesitated. Vanessa stepped in before he could answer. The association has easement rights. Do you? I asked. Harold swallowed visibly. I reached into my pocket again and removed my phone. With 2 taps, I opened the security footage. Then I handed it to Officer Reyes. The video showed Harold clearly. Night timestamp visible, gloves on, flashlight in hand, entering through my side gate, tagging my property. Remaining on premises for 4 minutes and 22 seconds. Officer Reyes watched the full clip without expression. When he handed the phone back, his face had changed. Mr. Benton, he said, did you have written authorization to enter fenced private property? Harold opened his mouth, closed it, then looked helplessly at Vanessa. Vanessa snapped. He was performing compliance duties under board authority. That's not an answer, Officer Henson said. Vanessa turned sharply toward her. Excuse me? Officer Henson met her stare without blinking. I asked if he had written authorization. Harold's voice came out thin. No. A murmur rippled through the neighbors like wind through dry leaves. Mrs. Turner placed one hand dramatically against her chest. Melissa Grant whispered something into Jason's ear, and his eyebrows shot upward. Keegan folded his arms. Additionally, he said, we have reason to believe false representations were made to local law enforcement in order to trigger coercive intervention against Mr. Miller. Officer Reyes looked at Vanessa now. Ma'am, did you inform dispatch that Mr. Miller was obstructing lawful seizure of property? Yes, she said stiffly. On what legal basis was the property subject to seizure? The HOA covenant grants. Ma'am, Reyes interrupted, firmer now. HOA covenants do not authorize confiscation of personal property without court order. That sentence hit harder than any accusation I could have made, because it was spoken not by me, but by the police officer she had summoned. Vanessa's composure cracked around the edges. She took one sharp breath and turned toward me with barely disguised anger. You orchestrated this. No, I said. You did. The flatbed contractors near the truck were already retreating toward their cab, suddenly eager to be somewhere else. One of them climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. Harold noticed and called after them, but they ignored him completely. Keegan stepped closer to Vanessa. Miss Cole, until this matter is reviewed, any further enforcement actions against Mr. Miller's property are suspended pending investigation. You can't suspend HOA authority. I can when it intersects with unlawful conduct. Her jaw tightened. This is harassment. No, I said again, this is accountability. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then an unexpected voice rose from behind the crowd. It was Eleanor Pierce from the corner house. She was in her 70s, always impeccably dressed, and had lived in Maple Glen longer than anyone except old Mr. Leland. She stepped forward holding a stack of envelopes. I believe I should say something, she announced. Vanessa turned sharply. Mrs. Pierce, this is not the time. Oh, I think it is exactly the time. Eleanor held up the envelopes for everyone to see. These are violation notices sent to me over the past year, 12 of them, for things as ridiculous as wind chimes and bird feeders. The crowd stirred. Then another voice joined. Jason Grant raised his hand. We got fined $200 for chalk drawings our kids made on our own driveway. Melissa nodded beside him, and nobody could appeal because the hearings were always scheduled during work hours. Mrs. Turner lifted her watering can like evidence. I was cited for an unapproved flower pot. Now the murmurs became overlapping complaints, one neighbor after another. Different houses, different violations. Same pattern, late notices, escalating fines, no real appeal path. Harold's face drained of color as he looked around at the growing unrest. Vanessa tried to regain control. Order, please. These are unrelated grievances. No, Keegan said calmly, they may be highly related. He turned to his second officer. Document names and statements. The officer opened the black case and removed recording forms. Vanessa took a step backward, then another. She was losing the street, losing the narrative, and she knew it. But she still had one card left to play. She straightened her blazer, forced her voice steady, and looked directly at me. You may have embarrassed me today, Richard, she said, but this isn't over. The board still governs this neighborhood. We can still place liens, initiate civil action, and restrict your property rights. That got the neighbors quiet again, because liens were serious. Even now, fear still worked. I looked at her for a long moment, Then I said the one thing she clearly never expected me to know. Not if your board charter renewal was never legally ratified with the county. Her face froze. Harold turned toward her so fast he nearly dropped his folder. Officer Reyes frowned. What does that mean? I pulled a folded document from inside my jacket. Certified county clerk copy, stamped and dated. I checked after our first meeting, I said. Maple Glen HOA's amended enforcement charter expired 14 months ago. The renewal filing was rejected due to procedural defects. The board has been operating under invalid amended authority ever since. The entire street seemed to inhale at once. Vanessa's lips parted, but no words came out. Harold whispered hoarsely, Vanessa, tell me that's not true. She said nothing, and in that silence, every person on Maple Glen Drive understood the same thing. The woman who had spent years threatening everyone with rules may not have had the legal power to enforce any of them. Keegan slowly took the document from my hand and examined the seal. Then he looked up at Vanessa Cole with an expression that had gone completely cold. Miss Cole, he said, I strongly advise you not to leave town. And that was the moment Harold Benton dropped the folder. Pages exploded across my driveway like snow. Harold Benton dropped to his knees in the middle of my driveway, scrambling after the papers as they scattered beneath the morning wind. Violation notices, fine assessments, photographs, handwritten logs, payment demands, years of Maple Glen HOA enforcement records spilled across the concrete in full view of everyone who had gathered to watch. One loose page skidded all the way to Mrs. Turner's slippered feet. She bent down, picked it up, and adjusted her glasses. Then she read aloud, loud enough for half the street to hear. Unauthorized seasonal wreath display. Fine, $100. The crowd erupted into angry disbelief. That was Christmas, someone called out. You fined her for Christmas? Vanessa lunged toward Mrs. Turner. Those are confidential HOA records. Officer Henson stepped between them instantly. Ma'am, stop right there. Vanessa froze. That was the first time I saw fear replace anger in her eyes. Harold was still on the ground, sweating now, gathering papers with trembling hands, but the damage was done. Too many neighbors had already picked up documents of their own. Jason Grant held one up. This says they cited us before the chalk drawings even happened. Melissa grabbed the page from him and stared at the printed date. Oh my God, she said. This was filed 3 days before our kids even drew on the driveway. Keegan turned sharply toward Harold. Predated violations? Harold looked trapped. I only processed what I was told to process. Vanessa snapped toward him. Be careful what you say. No, Harold said suddenly, rising to his feet with a strange desperation in his voice. No, I'm done covering for this. The entire street went silent again. Vanessa stared at him as if she had just been slapped. Harold clutched a bundle of papers to his chest and looked at Keegan. She ordered all of it, he said. The selective fines, the false late fees, the duplicate notices. She targeted residents who challenged board decisions. Vanessa's voice cracked like a whip. You incompetent coward. You told me to alter timestamps? Harold shot back. You told me to backdate warning notices so appeals would expire before residents received them. Several neighbors gasped. Officer Reyes immediately pulled out his notebook again. Mr. Benton, he said, are you making a formal statement? Harold closed his eyes for one long second, then nodded. Yes. Vanessa stepped backward, shaking her head. This is ridiculous. He's lying to save himself. But Harold was no longer looking at her. He pointed toward the clubhouse down the street. The board archives are in the basement records room. Email printouts too. Everything's there. Keegan gave one short nod to his second officer, who immediately walked back toward the SUV and radioed for additional personnel. Vanessa turned to me then, her voice lower, colder. You've destroyed this neighborhood. I looked around at the people surrounding us. At the neighbors who had spent years afraid to speak. At the piles of fraudulent paperwork now exposed in daylight. No, I said. You did that yourself. For a moment, Vanessa seemed to realize there was no way back. No speech she could give, no authority left to claim. Then she made one final reckless move. She spun toward her car parked across the street and started walking fast. Officer Reyes called after her. Ma'am, stop. She ignored him. He moved quickly, catching up before she reached the driver's door. Vanessa Cole, you need to remain here pending further investigation. She jerked her arm free. I am not under arrest. No, Reyes said firmly, but if you interfere with an active inquiry, that can change. Across the street, curtains were still shifting in windows. Phones were still recording. Maple Glen had become a courtroom without walls, and just when it seemed the morning could not get more explosive, Eleanor Pierce raised her voice again from the sidewalk. There's something else. Every head turned. She held up another envelope, thicker than the others. This one came to my late husband after he died. Even Keegan looked startled. Eleanor's hands trembled, but her voice stayed steady. It was a penalty notice threatening legal action for failure to remove a vehicle from our driveway. She swallowed hard. My husband had been dead for 6 months. The vehicle was his wheelchair van. The silence that followed was heavier than anything yet. Vanessa lowered her eyes, and for the first time, nobody on that street saw her as powerful. Only small, exposed, finished. That was when the additional black sedans turned into Maple Glen Drive. The 2 black sedans rolled slowly into Maple Glen Drive and stopped in front of the clubhouse entrance, their tires crunching over the decorative gravel Vanessa Cole had once fined 3 homeowners for disturbing. By then, the entire neighborhood had transformed into something unrecognizable from the polished, silent street it had been just hours earlier. People were no longer hiding behind curtains. They were outside now, standing together in driveways, talking openly, comparing notices, sharing stories that had apparently been buried for years under quiet resentment and fear. What Vanessa had built in Maple Glen depended on isolation, on convincing each resident they were alone. That morning, that illusion collapsed. 3 county investigators stepped out of the sedans carrying document cases and evidence seals. Keegan met them halfway up the sidewalk and handed over the certified charter records I had shown him. Officer Reyes remained near Vanessa, who now stood rigid beside her car, her arms wrapped around herself, as if she were physically trying to hold her authority together. Harold Benton sat on the curb near my mailbox, pale and exhausted, answering questions from Officer Henson while his fallen paperwork was collected into evidence folders. I watched it all from the edge of my driveway, and for the first time since this began, I felt something unfamiliar settle into my chest. Relief. Not triumph, not revenge, just relief. Because this had never really been about winning. It had been about stopping something that should have stopped long ago. Keegan returned to me after briefing the county investigators. Mr. Miller, he said, they'll be freezing all active Maple Glen enforcement actions until a full audit is completed. How long will that take? Given what's already surfaced? He glanced toward Vanessa. Not long. Across the street, Mrs. Turner had gathered with Eleanor Pierce, Jason and Melissa Grant, and several others. What had started as spectatorship had become solidarity. Jason crossed over to my driveway. I owe you an apology, he said. For what? He gave a sheepish half-smile. I thought you were just the new guy causing trouble at that board meeting. Melissa joined him, folding her arms. Turns out, you were the only one asking the right questions. Mrs. Turner raised her watering can in my direction like a ceremonial toast. Hear, hear. Even old Mr. Leland had come down from his porch now, walking slowly with his cane. He stopped beside me and looked toward the clubhouse. I've lived here 19 years, he said quietly. First time I've seen anyone stand up to that woman. I nodded once. Someone had to. At nearly noon, the investigators entered the clubhouse with Harold Benton accompanying them under supervision. Vanessa tried once more to regain control. She stepped toward Keegan and demanded legal representation before surrendering any board documents. Keegan calmly informed her that the records belonged to the association, not her personally, and that obstruction at this stage would only worsen her position. That was when she turned toward me one last time. There was no anger left in her face now, only bitterness. You could have handled this privately, she said. I met her gaze evenly. You could have treated people fairly. She said nothing after that. Officer Reyes opened the rear passenger door of his cruiser, not to arrest her, but to transport her downtown for formal questioning pending fraud review. The symbolism was enough. Every neighbor on that street watched as Vanessa Cole, who had spent years threatening everyone else with penalties and enforcement, sat in the back seat of the very police car she had summoned to intimidate me. As the cruiser pulled away, nobody waved. Nobody spoke. They simply watched until it disappeared around the corner. By late afternoon, the flatbed truck was long gone. The pergola beams were still stacked neatly beside my garage where they belonged. County notices were posted at the clubhouse entrance suspending all board fines and hearings until further notice. And for the first time since I moved into Maple Glen Estates, the neighborhood felt like an actual community. That evening, several neighbors gathered in my backyard. Jason brought folding chairs, Melissa brought sandwiches, Mrs. Turner brought lemon bars that she claimed were victory bars, though nobody questioned what made them official. Even Eleanor Pierce stayed until sunset, sitting beneath the unfinished pergola frame and telling stories about when Maple Glen was first built. At one point, Jason looked around the yard and laughed. "You realize," he said, "this pergola may become neighborhood legend now." I looked at the cedar beams stacked beside us. Then I guess I better finish building it. A week later, Maple Glen's entire HOA board resigned. A temporary resident committee was formed by volunteer vote. Eleanor Pierce became interim chair. Jason handled communications. Melissa organized audit transparency meetings. Mrs. Turner, to everyone's amusement, was placed in charge of landscaping review and immediately abolished decorative flower pot citations forever. As for Harold Benton, he cooperated fully with investigators and avoided criminal charges in exchange for testimony and evidence. Vanessa Cole, however, faced fraud inquiries, civil misconduct claims, and multiple pending lawsuits from residents whose fines had been unlawfully collected. And me? I finally built the pergola. It took 2 weekends, 1 borrowed ladder, and more unsolicited advice from neighbors than any one man needs in a lifetime. But when it was finished, the entire street came over for the first official gathering beneath it. No violation notices, no hidden cameras, no threats taped to mailboxes. Just neighbors sitting together under cedar beams the HOA once tried to confiscate. Funny how things change when people stop being afraid. Sometimes authority looks untouchable, right up until the moment someone asks it to prove itself. And sometimes the people who try hardest to control others forget the simplest truth of all. Power without legitimacy collapses the second someone turns on the light. What would you do if this happened to you? Share your experience below. Subscribe to our channel for more real stories that teach and entertain.